Well, good evening and welcome everyone. We are honored and excited to have Professor Peter Zelg with us tonight. A few weeks ago, we had the privilege of hosting Professor Zelg, who delivered a unique lecture on Hannah Arendt. Professor Zelg has always shown us great warmth and deepest concern. Thank you so much, Peter, for your deep commitment to Israel, marked by compassion and integrity, as we continue our journey towards freedom. Peter, with your permission, I will now switch to Hebrew to introduce you. Okay. ערב טוב, חברים יקרים. הערב נשמע את פרופסור זלג שידבר על הפנייה האחרונה. הלא היא ההרצאה האחרונה שנשא רודולף שטיינר לפני קהל ב-28 בספטמבר 1924, ערב חג מיכאל, וחודשים ספורים לפני שחצה את הסף. הפנייה האחרונה היא קריאה עבורנו, להיזכר במשימתנו רוחנית דווקא בתקופה זו, בה השבר הוא בשיאו, ואזכור עבורנו להתעורר להתרחשות הגבוהה בעולמות הרוח, ולשליחותנו בעת הזו. פרופסור זלג הוא רופא, מומחה לפסיכיאטריה ופסיכותרפיה של ילדים ונוער, מנהל את מכון איטה וגמן למחקר בארלסהיים, חבר בהנהגת הסקציה הכללית לאנתרופוסופיה בבית הספר למדעי הרוח בגיטיאנו. תחת ידו הודפסו עשרות ספרים בגרמנית, בחלקם אף תורגם לאנגלית. Professor Zelg, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Nurit, and all of you coming together tonight. I was asked to give a contribution about Dr. Steiner's last address, knowing that some of you or many of you took part in a conference, as I heard, and I would have loved to come, would have loved to get a flight, but I was booked a Karma conference in Brazil. I haven't been in Sao Paulo, but I gave 2 lectures on this challenging topic, and I couldn't vanish from the program. So hope that it will be soon possible. And now we do it under these conditions. A contribution about Steiner's farewell or his so-called last address. And the subtitle was wished by the organizers, its relevance for our time, its importance. This makes it quite difficult, to be honest, because in a way, in a situation as yours in Israel, I think, how can people come from the Goethe Anum or from Arlesheim and say what is needed? Even if they connect to Rudolf Steiner, but even this connection makes it sometimes very difficult because our own personal statements are not the ones of Steiner in our time. And I think it's very difficult to make a direct connection from the so-called last address to what we or even what you have to do today. So I don't have the courage to be an advisor, and hopefully this was not the meaning of the invitation, but I still have the courage that if we take for serious what Dr. Steiner brought and connect to it, I am convinced that we create possibilities for intuitive decisions out of ourselves, so that there is no general advising and no general message. It is so difficult to say what is the message of Steiner for our time. And I think he never wanted to have these kind of prescriptions, as I would say, as a doctor or therapist. But I think what he wanted to have, that we have this close connection to anthroposophy, and out of anthroposophy open the sources for healing, or the sources just for behaving in a good way, in an appropriate way, in the sense of maybe Viktor Frankl, who said in a meaningful way. That means in every single unique situation, we have to do something, but it's not a solution for all of us. It is just for me. So this was, as you know, the conviction of Viktor Frankl, a Jewish conviction. He said that man on earth is responsible for every single step and is answering, is called by the spiritual world and has to answer. And every single situation in our lives, we have to answer to a call, and to find the right answer, the appropriate, my own answer to a specific situation. This is meaning. Viktor Frankl, as far as I understood him, said meaning means to take out of every single situation what I have to do. And then I'm following the star. And I would say this is also the star of the Christmas conference. This is no other star. This has to do with being a disciple of Michael in the time given. But listen, learn to listen what is needed, done by me. And I know we have a lot of political discussions, what should be done, what could be done. This is also important, but on another spiritual level, I think it is this voice, this call, find out what you have to do. So what are the results or the messages of the last address of Dr. Steiner? I can't draw the lines. What I want to do tonight or in the next 55 minutes, or I don't know how long we have, but I think we have this hour at least together, is to focus in a deeper understanding of this address. Mainly also because we can say it is the last address, and we are right. But I pretend to say that Dr. Steiner did not know it. So it was not meant as the last address. In fact, just the contrary, it was meant to be a preparation for the next day. And the next day after the so-called last address was the Michael Day. And as you know, Dr. Steiner said at the beginning of the so-called last address, he just came to prepare the mood for tomorrow. So this is not a typical situation of saying goodbye or drawing the conclusion of a life, but this is more preparing the day of Michael. Maybe that is what Steiner did in his whole biography. And it's an honor to focus tonight together with you and in this extremely difficult situation in your country, to focus on this farewell of Steiner in this time we live. Also, we still live, I think, in this kind of etheric body of Rudolf Steiner as anthroposophist. I mean, he died 100 years ago, or we are approaching the death day, 100 years death day. But I felt all the last years we are not only connected, but still a little bit protected. That means living with Rudolf Steiner's entity means something for us. And I think it is wonderful to have the chance tonight to focus on these last words to the people which came together in the carpentry hall, because in a way the leading thoughts and what Steiner brought on the sickbed, this is an ongoing speech or an ongoing teaching, but it was the last time that 600 people were standing and sitting there. And we all know how unique is the situation of being really there, not via Zoom and not in another type of distance, but really share the same room, being together. And tonight, it's a special day for the history of Anthroposophy, the 17th of November. Not so well known because Anthroposophists, at least in Middle Europe, most of them have no deeper connection to history, I would say, or to the conscience of history. I mean, Jewish people in general have a deep sense of history, but in Dornach or Germany or Switzerland, history is the past. It seems to be the past, and I hear it quite often, we have to be in the present for the future and more or less forget the past because it's done. But this is not at all a Jewish understanding of history, and I would say it's also not an anthroposophical understanding of history because it's not done. It's not done. It is not something behind us, solved. It is most part of history is unlived history. It's the world of becoming which couldn't flourish in the past. And when we talked last time, or I talked and you listened, sorry, about Hannah Arendt, this was so much of unlived history. And it's good to focus on this, what had to be brought from the so-called past to the present and the future. And the 17th of November is a very special occult day because it's the foundation day of the Theosophical Society. It was founded in New York, Blavatsky Alcott in 1875. And this is an enormous date in the spiritual world history. Sorry, I mean, we all have a certain tendency to underestimate the Theosophical Society because I would say it lost its mission, partly. But in Steiner's time, it was enormous important that he found it spiritually. Physically, it was getting weaker and weaker, but spiritually, it was an enormous platform with the masters. And in the same 17th of November, but in 91, Marie von Sievers brought the question to Dr. Steiner on this founding day of the Theosophical Society, and the conversation took place in Berlin. She said, isn't it time to start something anew in Europe out of the spiritual tradition and sources of Europe, not coming from Asia, from Adyar, and so on. That same day, she brought the questions. Today, if you like this connection. So maybe it's interesting that we focus on the onset, the onset of the beginning of the Theosophical Society. And by this question, Steiner said, then by the question, I could start to give the answer. And the answer was more or less founding the Anthroposophical movement in Middle Europe at the beginning of the 20th century. So we focus on the last address on a day which, in the sense of a spiritual history of the Anthroposophical movement, is a birthday. Yeah. So before we go to the last address, I want to focus on the weeks preceding, because I thought this year it is not so easy to understand this text without knowing what happened in the weeks and weeks before. Of course, we can separate, and we can study the lecture, and we can go into the depth. And in a way, if we do so, we don't need other texts. We only have this one, and it could be very productive. But we should, on the other side, know it was part of life. It was part of Dr. Steiners' life and the life of the Goetheanum Hill. So we can focus on the fragment, but the fragment is belonging to an entity, to a wholeness. And I think good research is always seeing the wholeness. And when Gershom Scholem was researching the Kabbalah, he was a master in going in the little details, but knowing about all the other details. And I think in our case for tonight, I would like really to go a little bit back to the preceding weeks. Because these weeks were for me a kind of a birth event 9 months after the Christmas conference. The Christmas conference we are used to handle it as a kind of a birth. And it's, of course, fitting to Christmas, natality. But on the other side, I would say the Christmas conference was also a conception. What Steiner conceived was a new image of the Anthroposophical Society and also the School for Spiritual Science. And he explained it, but partly our dear brothers and sisters couldn't understand him. And I think it was difficult to understand him. He was talking, let's say, about a medical section, but it wasn't there. You couldn't see it. I mean, there was no section, no department for medicine. Steiner was treating something as real, which was at this stage only potential. That's how he lived in general, to handle as realities what are only seeds at the moment, but grow. But I think after 9 months, something became visible. And it's important to know that not only 1,000 people gathered in Dornach in September 24, but they belong to different professional groups. So that means the doctors, therapists were there, the priests were there, the artists were there, and they all got special courses. And this is typical for a school for spiritual science, for a kind of a high school, that there is specific knowledge out of a discipline, out of a faculty, something only needed to know for the doctors, or the priests, or the artists. And this was the first gathering in Dr. Steiner's biography, where he gave 6 parallel courses in 19 days. It started on the 5th of September and ended on the 23rd of September. So 5 days before the so-called last address. And this was a kind, as Albert Steffen said, culmination, spiritual culmination of anthroposophy. What's brought Steiner in those 19 days was unbelievable. And I would say he gave for the future in an extreme way. An example, the priests came, the priests of the Christian community came because he invited them to come for a course about apocalypse. And he said maybe 2 or 3 lectures. So they came and the course started and it went on and it went on and it went on. And they had their congregations at home. They had their families at home. Work had to be done. But Steiner said every day until tomorrow. And at a certain point, they asked Emil Bock to go to Steiner and ask how long it will go on. And then Steiner, very serious, answered to Emil Bock that he asks for patience for another 2 or 3 days, and then it will become clear, he said, how long we will have to continue. He did not know, Steiner. He did not know. He just had to go on together with them, and there was no end he could easily foresaw. I mean, this is very difficult for a conference, isn't it? If you take part in Harduf or I don't know where else, and they say it's open end. They did not say it before, but what I wanted to say, they were part of a process. And it was difficult. It was far beyond a normal program, what happened there. And Willem Seilmans van Ammichhoven, a very famous anthroposophist and psychiatrist from the Netherlands, said, in the last lecture Steiner gave, it was almost difficult to follow his words, because he was just radiating love and spirit. In a way, it was a kind of giving a substance of love and life and light. They followed the words, of course, but in a way it was not only wording, it was also offering, and it was enormously what happened there. Full of wisdom, an incredible amount of wisdom. In one of these courses about apocalypse, at the end, there was a little situation. Mary Steiner left the room, it was the carpentry hall, and met a priest. And the priest, and she said to the priest about Rudolf Steiner, is this still a human being at all? It is an enormous question, isn't it, of Mary Steiner, who shared her life with Rudolf Steiner since more than 20 years. Leaving the hall or this room of the lecture, she posed the question, is this Rudolf Steiner still a human being at all? It was very serious. She could not understand how he was able to this spiritual hate and to this kind of teaching. Who is he? So it was enormous and, of course, very serious, the apocalypse. I come back to it. But I also want to stress and underline, even it's maybe not fitting to the actual situation in your country, it was a situation not only of seriousness, it was also of joy. And it had to do that most of those anthroposophists listening to Steiner were absolutely young. So I think the average age of the priests of the Christian community was 25. It was a youth group. And the whole meeting was a kind of a youth meeting. And they slept in a huge hall in one of the hotels, I can't say, but one of the these institutions in Dornach, so they couldn't afford a room for their own, so a mass quarter. And some of them were 19 years old or 21. And I said there was a course for the doctors and a course for the priests, but later on they mixed each other up because in a way they were all friends, this young generation. And I don't think that the priests told the therapist the details of their course, but they shared their impressions. And why it is important for us, because what was what happened was the first time in the anthroposophical history that there was a kind of a building of a community, a building of a professional community or an interprofessional community. The priests, the doctors, the artists. It was only an image of a future which seemed for Dr. Steiner of maximal importance, that the School for Spiritual Science is getting a place, a site where impulses come for the transformation of the society, not only of the anthroposophical, but the whole society. Transformation of economy, transformation of medicine, education, transformation of natural science, and finally also transformation of policy. We have to go on in a different way to reorganize social life beyond national states. This was for Steiner a clear message. But it was not a political impulse. It was more or less a Michaelic impulse in transforming the given world. But he had to start concrete, with concrete people, farmers, doctors, teachers. And it was the first time that they met at the Goetheanum and had their courses parallel. And it was unbelievable because Steiner was a sick person, but he gave some of the days 6 lectures a day. I created a little booklet in September but it's not in Hebrew, even not in English, only Old German, yeah. But I brought this a little bit together to show what he did. And it's important because it was a future impulse of this. And there was joy, as I said to you, even if they were totally overburdened by wisdom. And there was also joy because the sun was shining. And this was exceptional because 100 years ago, the summer in Middle Europe was very rainy and comparatively cold. And the harvest failed more or less because most of the fields were flooded. And in Ticino, the rivers as Maggia went beyond their borders, but also in St. Petersburg. And then in these 19 days, the sun was shining. It's a little bit as in the Old Testament or in other stories when the weather changed. And it was 19 days of sunshine, very warm. And they could not believe what happened. So it was extraordinary. And if you ask a little bit about the main motifs, I would say the first one, most principal, and then ending in the last address, was the Michaelic motif. Steiner started an evening lecture. I should say this. In the evenings, they were all together, but not for party. They were all together for a Karma lecture, the one day, and the other day a class lesson for those who were members of the School for Spiritual Science. But this was the majority. And it was alternative. And it was so incredibly dense that Emil Bock wrote at home, it is so dense as the world end is close. That means Dr. Steiner makes such a concentration. So every evening they were all together, almost all together. And in the first Karma lecture, Steiner said in the September gathering, now that we have been under the effects of the Christmas conference for many months, 9 months, under the effect of the Christmas conference. And then he's talking about Michael. And he's talking all those 19 days, I would say, about Michael, about the power of the spiritual sun. about this great mighty penetration with the Michael power and the Michael will. And it's until the last address that Dr. Steiner is saying Michael is preceding Christ in our time after his great metamorphosis. And we are working with Michael that the Christ power can come into the right way to earth. It's very interesting. We precede Christ in supporting Michael. So he is really the one preceding the Christ will and implant the Christ power in the right way. And then Steiner said an enormous thing in the, it was in the Apocalypse course for the priests. He said that now the mystery forces are urgently needed on earth. The mystery forces, because all other forces who were driving the evolution are exhausted now. He says really that there will only be a further evolution if the mystery forces come into culture. If not, there will be decay, abyss, and ending. So he says more or less, since the beginning of the world history, there were forces creating the future, but they are exhausted now. So mystery forces, this is not an additional thing for those who seek the esoteric. It is a survival precondition for the future, he said. We need them. But, and I think this is very important also for us in a situation where I think not only in Israel, but it's very extreme now there is no solution to be seen from a political point of view, and maybe there are no political solutions. And maybe it is a trait for our time that there is no solution out of the past. We can also say there is no solution out of the forces who created the present and the past. We need not only new solutions, but we need new forces to create solutions. In a way, we can say we need to be anew, a kind of resurrection of man, resurrection forces or mystery forces. But this means as well we need to be other human beings. Or Steiner said in the September, something must come again that is similar to the workings of the ancient mysteries and which has been described as the sacrificial surrender of the whole human being, the absorption of the whole human being in his task. A kind of, in German it is hingegebenes Opfersein, a sacrificial surrender of the whole human being. So it's not only to have additional forces, but to consecrate your own life to this new onset. This is very difficult to understand, and but maybe sometimes in such extreme situation as you are, sometimes maybe I think we come closer to this reality that there are new onsets needed, and also a new relationship to the human being, to this, to his work or to this coming future. So I think a lot of things he said in September are for our time and the forthcoming future, even if he talked of the past. Now, I mentioned quite often the Apocalypse course, which was only for the priests. It was past. I mean, he focused again on Ephesus. You know it very well from the Christians conference, his descriptions about Ephesus, Kratilos, Mysa, Heraclitus, and especially the mysteries of Ephesus, the mysteries of Logos, the mysteries of incarnation, the mysteries of the forming of the ether body, the cosmic forming of the ether body. Ephesus as an enormous place of transformation of the old mysteries of the East, the Asian mysteries, to the European ones, and then destroyed, because this should not happen. From the demons aspect, they didn't want to have that Asia, that the light from the East will transform into the light of the middle on the way to the West. Bridging East, Middle, and West, this should be prevented. And until today, I think we suffer from this destruction of Ephesus, but not as a building only, but in this kind of let come in to Europe the old Asian wisdom, but try to transform it in what is needed for our time there. The Theosophical Society, by the way, 19th of November, they tried to open the entrance, but maybe they were lacking in transform what came in. Steiner was a master in transforming and making anew. He never pretended that all anthroposophy is completely anew, but it is for our time. And now back to the Apocalypse course. He's not talking about, again, about the old mysteries in Ephesus, but about the first Christian community there. I mean, the first Christian community in Ephesus, Steiner said, embraced Christianity most intensively. Also, historically, it is partly known that St. Paul came 21 years after the mystery of Golgotha from Palestine to Ephesus, which is not just in the neighborhood. He directly went there and then left and came back. It was a long time St. Paul was there. And even when he was captured by the Romans and brought to the prison, he sent a letter to the Christian community in Ephesus, which it became famous, this letter, because he's talking in this letter about how to handle evil. The famous Ephesus letter of Paul, we know it maybe from religious teachings, but it is very concrete, because this mystery side had to do with the mystery of good and evil. And they should take care to protect themselves against evil and against the abuse of the word. 12 years after Paul, St. John came to Ephesus with Mary and stayed a long time there, but also was deported to Rome. And the history said that he was deported because he refused to acknowledge Caesar, divine character, through a sacrificial act in the Artemision. So he did not want to serve the power, the Roman power. He did not want to abuse the old mystery side. And so they took him to Rome, but they did not kill him. They brought him to Patmos, which is another Artemision site. And from Patmos, in Patmos, he wrote the Apocalypse. And then after a certain time, had a chance, it was after the death of Domitian, to go back to Ephesus. And there, as you know, he wrote his gospel at the Logos side of Heraclitus, of Kratilos. In the beginning was the Word. Steiner came back to this And I think it's important for all of us, the mystery of logos and evil, the abuse of the word, also in politics. There's a wonderful biography about Paul Celan, the writer, by an American professor, and he said that the German National Socialism was also a power abusing the word, the language, not only the German language, but the language at all. He shows more or less that in the 20th century, never before the abuse of language for political defamation, for political crimes, to invent special languages to cover what crimes are going on, to abuse language in general. This is an important element of the 20th century. Propaganda, abusing language, abusing the logos, or trying to grasp the logos in a demonic way. And in the Apocalypse course, and in the whole September course, Steiner gave another impulse. These were weeks of the logos, I would say. The main course at the Goetheanum was not for the priests, it was for the artists. It was about drama and speech formation. This was the main course. It was about how the artistic approach to the word. But I think even the priests were touched by it, because in a way, this is how to use the word of prayer and the word of worship, which has a long tradition in Israel, isn't it? The word in the sense of prayer and worship, the cultic action. So the logos also in a spiritual sense. Knowing about evil, the knowledge of evil. And it was striking when Dr. Steiners said in the September course, one would have to say in the apocalyptic sense, before the Christ in the ether can be grasped by people in the right way, humanity must first come to terms with the encounter of the beast that rises in 1933. That is apocalyptically speaking. Never before Dr. Steiner brought the year of Hitler in such a strong way, 1933. The beast of the apocalypse is coming from the abyss. He mentioned the year 1933, 5, and 7 in some other lectures as a very dramatic time which will come. But in this singular sense, with the beast coming out of the abyss, this is just before the last address. And not only this, he also hinted to the end of the 20th century, saying the sun demon will appear, will raise its head, Sorat, the spirit that contradicts Christ and Michael. So in a way, I think Steiner was preparing those generations sitting around him. He was to go. Steiner was sick. He had to go, but they came. They were the generations of the first doctors and teachers, and they had to go out in this epoch of genocides and evil and the light. I mean, recapitulating the 20th century, we can say it was an enormous destruction and an enormous amount of light. So many positive development happened in the 20th century. We should not forget it. And also when Dr. Steiner said, there will be one leading challenge and question in the 20th century, and this will be human relationship. Beziehungen in German. He said this will be the main topic of the 20th century. We can now say exactly human relationships or relationships became the topic. And from living communities to interpersonal things, it was all based on relationship. I and you, which was not at all the case in the 19th century. So we see a time of light of Michael's came, but also the destruction was there. And Steiner said, we are going into dark kingdoms, but we have to enter them with our own light. We have to develop the power to bring our own light to the abyss. This is the path of the Michael school, the esoteric path, but it's also an exoteric path. We have to do it in the given world. And Steiner said, if we, as understanding people who know to interpret the signs of the times, organize our lives in the spirit, we have to do it out of these three mysteries of our time: the Michael mystery, the Christ mystery, and the Sorat mystery. Then we will work in the right way in the area that our karma has assigned to us. So in the future, Dr. Steiner said, but the future is now, we have to organize, balance our life in the neighborhood of three mysteries: Christ, Michael, and Sorat. Anthroposophists, they tend to talk a lot about Christ and Michael, but there is a third. Of course, we shouldn't be bent by the third. There are other anthroposophists, they are specialists for Ahriman pure. And in a way, it's also unbalanced. But how to find the right relation? Interesting that in September 24, Steiner admitted 250 people to the first class, to the School for Spiritual Science. He accepted their application, and he saw them personally in his atelier. He wanted to see them before giving the blue card, before signing the blue card. He wanted to pose some questions, and mainly at the end, he created a kind of a ritual. And he said to them at the end of this little conversation, if you want to remain loyal to the Michael school, please give me the hand. And also shake the hand of Dr. Wegmann, who will lead the Michael school with me. So this was in Steiner's studio. And this was an act to become a member of the School for Spiritual Science. And that meant not only to follow up a schooling path, but to carry the impulse, to be not a warrior, but to be a carrier of the Michael impulse, or to be a contributor of the School for Spiritual Science, as the Goetheanum is meant to be, with its different faculties, sections, and this together should form an esoteric core. And then, yeah, he said also this esoteric core is a body. This is the first time that Dr. Steiner is saying that the Michael school is forming a body, einen Leib. And there is a certain element of, again, St. Paul to the Ephesians, because in this famous letter from Rome to Ephesus, St. Paul is saying we are part of a spiritual body. Christ is the head. But we have to build the body together with all joints, with all. And for me, this is an enormous image for the future, that we try to form a spiritual body for the Christ Michael impulse. And the School for Spiritual Science is a bodybuilding initiative. And the society, the anthroposophical one, is carrying this school. And I think we can understand that Steiner saw all these dangerous situations coming, and what is needed against is, he said, Michael's castle. This was his name for the second Goetheanum, Michael's castle, eine Michaelsburg. But it's not enough to have a castle, then you only have a building. But to go out, people, they collect there, they meet there, they concentrate on their mission, and then they go back to their countries. And if there are good conferences at the Goetheanum, and sometimes it happens, and 1,000 people come, and then they are together, and then they go back. So Steiner prepared such a place. You know, there was no Goetheanum. At this time, it was empty, only a carpentry complex building. But he was preparing the model for the second building. So all these realities, which we sometimes have now, were not there. Was no conferences with people from 50 countries and coming together for curative education and then meeting and then going back. It was not there at all, but it was part of Dr. Steiner's anticipation. So preparing such a place, and a place of the Michael stream, just to finish this, and then coming to the last address. The Michael stream. In the Karma lecture, Dr. Steiner painted a huge picture that the so-called Michael stream is more or less a karmic connection in between human souls and also other spiritual entities, a kind of a surrounding of Michael and being close to him and his impulse and preparing an action together with him when he is again the leading spirit of time. And he was the leading spirit of time in the time of Aristotle and Plato, 4th century before Christ, and never again until 1879, 4 years after the foundation of the Theosophical Society. And this society was, spiritually spoken, preparing an action, but did not fulfill its mission. But Steiner then came with his initiative, and with those who wanted to serve Michael, to overcome Ahriman in this decisive 20th century and the followings. And Steiner prepared a place, but not only a building, but a center of activity, but not in the sense of hierarchy, but in the sense of an heart organ connected with the world initiatives for this Michael impulse, this Michael stream impulse. And in the Karma lectures, he in detail explained the stages of development of this Michael impulse. And then Dr. Steiner was completely exhausted, and he had to cancel any further lectures. So he did well until the end of these courses with this last force, but then it was over. And people were shocked when they have read there on a piece of paper that the next lectures are canceled. So 26th of September was canceled, 27th of September was canceled, which was very sad, because 27th of September, it was the first meeting after Kobowitz of the farmers who tried to practice BD, biologic dynamic tools. And they came to Dornach to talk to Steiner about their experiences. And he would have loved to see them, but he could not. And at the end of the 27th, there was a next class lesson announced, but it could not happen. And then suddenly, 28th of September, it was a Sunday, you could hear in the whispering around the hill, or I don't know how, that in the evening Dr. Steiner will speak. And interestingly enough, 600 people came by this mouth-to-mouth propaganda. It was no propaganda, but a transmission of an information. 600 people came spontaneously, and they were incredibly silent, which was not all the time the case. And then Dr. Steiner came, extremely slowly, together with Mary Steiner and Ita Wegman, in his winter coat. He had such a strong winter coat, heavy winter coat. This was extraordinary also in these September courses because it was so warm. But Steiner came with this heavy winter coat. He was freezing all the time. And then he came in very slowly and they were all standing. And it was not at all organized, but they just knew, stand up. So everybody stood there, 600 people when he came in, and then it was total silence. Not the slightest noise could be heard, Edwin Froboese said. And then you know how he started. It was impossible for me to speak to you yesterday and the day before yesterday. But I did not want to let the Michaelmas mood for today, which must radiate into our hearts and souls for tomorrow, pass without at least speaking briefly to you, my dear friends. At least speaking briefly. And it was then 20 minutes. And the voice, I can't tell you. I only know from the memories, it was very tender, very quiet, thoughtful. That means also slower than usual. In a kind of Michael consecration mood. And a priest of the Christian community, Jutta Frenzel, who was still there, said, because the priests went home after 19 days of lectures, and she said it was maybe lighter than usual. But she also said there was something like a Gethsemane mood behind what was spoken. This is not easy to grasp, or a Gethsemane mood. In Jerusalem, in the Gethsemane little forest with a mound of olives, or with the olive trees, there is no Gethsemane mood so easy to grasp, but maybe in the whole mound of olives and the Kidron Valley. I thought the 2 times I had a chance to be there, there is something. Of course, also with this old cemetery there, a Gethsemane mood was behind which was spoken. So if you read his last address, I think it is an enormous description, a Gethsemane mood behind. A critic would say, yes, but these memories of this lady are published or are done out of the knowledge that it was the last address. So it's easy to postulate a Gethsemane mood. But I think she was not a person of tricks. So in a way, she perceived it. And now this address, what is it? I mean, we can read it several times, we can study it, and we should do it. A lot of you do it as me every year. A holy day for me, this 28th of September, that he mentioned Elijah, seems to be very important. Because in a way, he's talking about the beginning and the end, from Alpha to Omega. And he was talking just in one sentence or in some words about the origins on earth and the purposeful meaning and power of Elijah. And I think there is a very strong relationship to Israel or to the spiritual origins of it from this onset of this Michael movement. But it's not only the onset. This is something still belonging to it. I think this is this misunderstanding of the past, that we think the past or the onset was only the onset. Now we are here. But it is all one entity. So we have to keep the origins alive. Elias or Elijah alive, the purposeful power, this kind of meaning. So Steiner is designing another image of this Michael movement, but it starts there more or less. And it has to do with the spiritual origins on earth at all. In the leading thought, Steiner then on the sickbed will describe how Michael, since the beginning of the time, was taking care for something we can call humanity. In a certain corner of the cosmos, Dr. Steiner will write then in the leading thoughts. And then, as you know, he is focusing mainly on this individuality, which started its path with Elias, a herald, kind of going and showing the Michael stream where to go. And it's important that he's talking so much about, not about Raphael, but Raphael's post-mortal way. Imagine that Steiner is close to death. That's not the reason why he is talking about post-mortal, but it's a reality that he was talking about the post-mortal path of Raphael, and also said to the audience, and you will follow him. And after going through the portal of death, you will meet. So in a way, it is also an address about life after death, but not in general, but for the Michael stream. And he describes then very specifically the experiences of this Elias Raphael individuality in this procedure. And just focusing on this Michael stream and then coming to the present and the future, saying that we have to take it in our hearts, that we have to take this mystery in our deepest heart, in our Michael loyal heart. It is not a loyalty to a political party, to a nation, to to the executive council in Dornach. No, it is to Michael. Give me your hand, Dr. Steiner said, that you will remain loyal to the Michael school. They had to do it on earth, the handshaking, but they did it spiritually before and after. And they should become noble helpers of Michael, faithful servants. We, not they, we, in a way. And should try to take this Michael will into their heart, which is very difficult. But isn't this maybe the sign of our time, that we have to bring the Michael will into our heart? And at the same time, and maybe it's the same process, that our self has to become apocalyptic. That's what Dr. Steiner said to the priests. It's not about studying the apocalypse only. It is about transforming your own self, that it becomes apocalyptic. Of course, it's not so easy to understand what does it mean, an apocalyptic self, or I, or ego, or however we call it. In German, it's Ich. Das apokalyptische Ich. Maybe we feel that we are living in a time where this is one of the main challenges, to take the apocalypse in the I and to transform ourselves. And then maybe we are able to a certain degree to serve Michael. And the last mantra, coming to an end now, I know that the time is over. The last famous mantra, the Michael imagination, Steiner spoke it as this priest of the Christian community described. He spoke it as a cry. Or I will quote her, especially the last mantra. I can't say it in any other way. It sounded like a great cry, a shattering cry, a shouting out into the world with all last strength. It was not a calm proclamation from the spiritual world as usual, but one suddenly saw how this Michael speech and this Michael life has been wrested from all the demons and dark forces of the world. Nevertheless, I had the feeling that angels were floating through the room. I don't often feel like that, but I couldn't help it. Tears kept streaming down my face during the 20 minutes, and so did many others. So a lot of them were crying the whole 20 minutes of this last address. A shattering cry, a great cry. So, and then he went out, slow. Again, they were all standing for a long time. Albert Steffen said, we left the room with an undescribable feeling of shock. Everyone felt that Rudolf Steiner's words had a testamentary character, but no one dared to speak about them. Even to themselves, they kept silent. So this sacrificial surrender of the whole person Steiner was talking about, there you could really see it by himself. Yeah, this was this kind of farewell. But as I mentioned at the beginning, and now we are at the end, it was not meant to be, as far as I can see, of being the last words, and Steiner directly went on. with the so-called leading thoughts. And I don't know how it is in Israel at the moment, but we try to really deepen into the leading thoughts at the moment in the general anthroposophical section. I mean, the leading thoughts of November 24, Ahriman and Michael, the fight for the human intelligence. October before, when Steiner brought his wonderful leading thoughts at the beginning of his sickbed time, and then coming to November, where we are now in the middle of November, it is a nutrition for our time. So I don't think that we should fix on the so-called last address, because Steiner went on. He went on with the leading thoughts, and this is the book until the 3rd of March, or even beyond. The 2 last articles were published in April after the cremation. So the leading thoughts survived the physical body, and I think it's one of the most important books on earth, the so-called leading thoughts. Steiner went on with all these themes in the leading thoughts. From the studio, he couldn't speak anymore to human beings or to the big room, but he could still write. And then he has read the text to Ita Wegman. So it became between I and you, and then it went out to the world. Yeah. Not tragic, I would say, very serious, but not tragic in the sense of per spiritum sanctum revivissimus. Steiner overcame. And the last example for this overcoming was the license for the second Goethe Annum. Steiner got the license to build against all protests from political parties. He got the license and could prepare the second building, Michael's Castle, and wanted to prepare the statue of Christ in between the entities of evil. So going on, and it's interesting, one of these courses, he ends with the word, everything that is done here is always just a fragment, always just a part, always just the first chapter. The first chapter. And I was very touched, and this is now really my end, when I went back to another group which shouldn't be ignored. He not only gave lectures in September to the priests and the doctors and the artists. No, there was another group, a professional group. These were the workmen at the Goethe Annum. Those people who were building the second building. And Steiner gave special lectures for them in September, 5 lectures. And then I wondered and asked myself, the questions, because this, probably the workers' lectures, they are not typical lectures. He always starts the lectures in asking, what kind of question have you brought to our meeting? And he's only answering questions. And then the last 2 meetings with the workman, in the one, he was asked by a young workman, Dr. Steiner, can you explain us what is anthroposophy in its essence and what is its mission? The mission of anthroposophy. Before they asked all details about weather and cosmos and rain, but then a young man asked what it is in the essence and what it is his task. He was new at the Hill, but he brought the fundamental question, and Steiner liked to answer. And then the last meeting was the last meeting at all, because this was after the doctors have gone, and the priests and the artists. And there was another meeting with Steiner. And the main question, or the one question brought to Steiner was, can you tell us where is the human being from? Where is man, the origin of man? This was really the question, the last question brought to Dr. Steiner. What is the origin of man? And Steiner liked it very much and gave a long lecture. And at the end, he said, now I started to give an answer. And this was his last meeting with the workman. He started to give the answer to the question, what is a human being from? I think it was so symptomatic and so good that it came out of the souls of those who worked on the hill, not of the anthroposophical group, but of the ordinary people group. What is the man? Where it's from? So to overcome the tragic sensation, I wanted to say it was all for future. It was a commitment for future. And in so far, for me, yes, it is the last address, but it is also the beginning of the future. And I hope that with some of the qualities I try to describe of the last address and the preceding weeks, I hope this can give us a certain inner strength for this per spiritum sanctum revivissimus, a kind of this Michaelic strength in our heart, a kind of this, the heart or the eye is becoming apocalyptic. And then maybe, as I said at the beginning, we will find out what we have to do, each of us, in specific situations, not in general. So I hope this can be the importance, or is an element of importance of the last address for our time, as far as I can see it with my very limited perspective.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really, it was so inspiring. You know, you described Steiner's final month and in his significant activities so vividly that I could imagine them in my spiritual senses, you know, and I was deeply moved. Thank you so much for your inspiration and for your important message for us that you share with us. And I open it for the audience. If someone want to ask or to thanks or to say something. You can open.
I would like to ask something, if possible.
Yes, of course, Ilan.
I would like to know, to understand Professor Zelg's point of view in regard of overcoming nationality in the last 4.5 years, that I personally experience as a very strong Ahrimanic gesture of authorities in the world. I kept contemplating about what Steiner said a lot about nationality and overcoming nationality, and how do we interpret it as an outcome of, I would say, the battle between Michaelic impulse and Ahrimanic impulses.
Yeah, thank you for the question. But it's very difficult to answer, to be honest. But I think from the schooling path of the soul, maybe the first question will be, how do we overcome it in ourselves? And the second one is then maybe how do we overcome it politically, what kind of social organism we have to develop, what is needed at such a next step of human evolution. And I think it is a next step of human evolution. The nations, and also in the sense of political nations, they were important. Steiner always said we should not underestimate the importance. It is not a wrong, it is not an error of world history. So they made sense, but time is at least partially over. And so we are in this extreme time of transition where I think worldwide a lot of people feel that something new has to come. We talked last time about Hannah Arendt. It was one of the most important themes of Hannah Arendt since 1934, 35, how to overcome national states. So it is since 90 years part of the needed political change. But at the same time, we see, and you said the last 4 years, this is a re-strengthening of all these forces. In Europe, I'm living in Germany, and all countries around are going back to their national power, to their right-wing parties, to their proudness of being a nation with borders. And it's not only in Europe, it is almost worldwide. But it's maybe typical for this time of transition that there is a relapse, that it's not just going forward, but the old demons, now they are demons. I would say in the past, there were good factors of evolution. It's very interesting in history as important forces of evolution, if they are surviving themselves, they become not only a problem, but a center of destroying positive evolution. So we see it, but on the other side, I think we see in every war, in every serious conflict, in a given country, that we in our own souls are again touched in a way where we are surprised what is happening to us ourselves. So the example, which is a little bit far distant from our actual situation in the First World War, Steiner's hope was that this cosmopolitan community at the Goetheanum will be a model for another way. Most of you will know that members of 17 nations were working at the Goetheanum, and we say it quite often. So if you have to defend anthroposophy in the public, or me too, I say, look at the Goetheanum. In the middle of the First World War, they erected on neutral ground the Goetheanum, and they came from 17 nations to work in it. But this is only part of the truth. The other part is there were heavy fights against each other and against their own souls, because the Russians, of course, felt quite different from the Germans and from those who came from Belgium, which was kept by the German army. And so they reacted as members of nations, even if they thought they are far beyond as anthroposophists. And I think, because you ask, I think one of the main challenge is to act on both levels. We can't find political social solution if we do not get anew as individuals. We had now, with the help of Udi and Orna, also Bassa Mandrami at the Goetheanum. And I know that there can also be a lot of questions, but what we all experienced and listened to their statements that they overcame. They overcame their starting point. But it was by a path of suffering. It was a schooling path of life, suffering life, which was worked through, which we know quite well from psychotherapy and from those we can accompany, a schooling path, mastering suffering, and to become new human beings. So they could not present a political solution, but they presented themselves, very modest, but in saying we are different than we were. And this is for me the basic element and the precondition to work together on a new social structure, which is so needed to overcome this national based state world in which we live. But at the moment, I know it is not a good time for innovations on social models. But I only wanted to stress that for me, it's at least acting on these both levels. And maybe there's a third, a real spiritual third. So the one is psychologically, I would say, what happens in my soul. The one is physical, to reorganize politics. This is part element of the physical world. And I think there is a third element. This is the pure spiritual. It is not so easy to understand how we can participate in the fight between Ahriman and Michael. But I'm sure that we have to participate purely spiritually without any weapons. And this is a third element of overcoming not only nationality, but also Ahriman on a spiritual level. And I think this has a lot to do with going the esoteric path of the Michael school. This is also an element of taking part in a spiritual overcoming. And strange enough, but also Michael needs our support, even there. So I'm not a expert, but I think these three levels are important.
First, I want to thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. And in these things that we try to work and we try to build what we can, we need knowledge. And Steiner was talking a lot about Ahriman, that what we need is recognition. And you brought something, he was talking about Sarat, and where is he talking about it? Because this is also something we might be facing and have to know how to face. And he spoke so little about it. I don't know where you're bringing it from.
Again, Leora, the point is exactly what you are looking for. Say it again. The Ahrimanic.
The Ahrimanic, we do our work, but we should recognize what we're facing against. And there's a lot of places Steiner writes about Ahriman, but very little about Sarat. So if you can tell us where to read so we can know what we're facing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the main source today for this little hints in the direction of Sarat were the Apocalypse course. As I said, this is now edited and readable, not only for the priests of the Christian community. So for those who understand German, this is collected works number 346. And I think this is the main source. And then there are some very short little remarks, but I think the main teaching is in the final course, which makes sense. So the so-called apocalypse course for the priests of the Christian community. I don't know if it's translated into Hebrew, but at least in English. Oh.
I think it is, and I'm going to look for it.
Yes. Is any
Other questions, remarks, comments?
Please, yeah.
Yeah, I would like to say something. In your the last question that people were asked Steiner was related to the origin of the human being. I myself find myself in a struggle to find the origin of human being inside myself in these days, especially in Israel. So your lecture or the meeting with you and the knowledge you brought us gave me a hint where to look at, because the way you describe Steiner, the way he met the people, the way he brought love, it was not only a question of content, but being a true human being. So I think it's very important. Give me a little hope or a way to do it by myself now. So I really want to thank you for that.
Thank you, Eyal, as well. And I personally can confess I was so touched when I came across the last questions of this workmen, carpenters, and all those at the Goethe Anum, that out of these people came the fundamental question. Because anthroposophists, we can always lose us in details, occult details, which are very interesting, fascinating. But then these fundamental questions, two of them, came from this workman at the Goethe Anum. And I thought this is so good for Steiner and his whole striving in this existence, that at the end, the echo, or it came from them. And yeah, as Eyal said, I think it is such an important question for us now to find the sources of our humanity, of being human in the depth of our soul. And thank you if the evening was a kind of Steiner contribution to this main challenge of our time.
Thank you so much, Peter. We have a lot to sleep on this night to think and to meditate. And thank you so much for this evening and for your time and warmth. Laila Tov.
Thank you for being with us.